Imagine walking through the University of Oxford, but instead of Latin inscriptions, you see verses of the Quran. It's a strange thought, right?
Yeah.
But that could be our present if things went differently 1,300 years ago
Mhm.
at the Battle of Tours.
Hmm.
So today we're doing a deep dive into this historical crossroads to see if this battle really saved Europe from Islamic rule, or whether it was just a blip in history.
Yeah, it's interesting how the story of the Battle of Tours has been used and reshaped over time to
hmm
fit certain narratives. It's like looking into a mirror to history. We learn as much about the fears and anxieties of later generations as we do about the actual events.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, some accounts making it out to be this huge clash of civilizations,
Yeah.
the ultimate showdown between Christianity and Islam.
Yeah.
And then others say it was just another raid, like a major one, sure, but not this pivotal moment
Yeah.
that decided the fate of Europe.
To really get the context, we have to go back to 732 AD, the Umayyad Caliphate. This incredibly powerful Islamic empire
Hmm.
was on what seemed like an unstoppable march. They had conquered huge territories across North Africa and Spain.
And at the same time, Europe was still recovering from the fall of Rome. It was a totally different world then, like a patchwork of kingdoms and territories, all competing for power and influence. So how did all this lead to two massive armies clashing on a battlefield in what is now France?
Well, the Umayyad Caliphate was driven by a bunch of factors: religious zeal, military ambition, the desire for wealth, and these things weren't separate. The promise of riches and plunder attracted warriors to their cause, which fueled their expansion.
Right, their conquest of Spain, for instance. It was brutally effective. They totally outmaneuvered the Visigothic king, crushed his forces, and sent shockwaves through what was left of the Christian West. It was a clear warning of the Umayyads' power and ambition.
What's really surprising is how quickly the Umayyads took over everything. In a decade, they'd swept through most of the Iberian Peninsula, which left many wondering, where would they turn their attention next?
Enter the Frankish kingdom, which wasn't exactly a model of unity and stability at the time. It was more like a tangled web of smaller territories, each ruled by ambitious nobles who were constantly fighting for power and influence.
It was a recipe for internal conflict, made even more dangerous by the looming threat of this aggressive, expanding empire right on their doorstep.
And it's in this mess of political scheming that we meet Charles Martel, the Duke of the Franks. He wasn't officially the king, but he was the real power behind the throne, calling the shots and holding huge influence.
Charles represents a power shift within the Frankish kingdom. The official rulers, the Merovingian kings, had become weak and ineffective. So that created a power vacuum that ambitious figures like Charles's father, Pepin of Herstal, were able to exploit.
So it's kind of like a real-life Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Alliances changing, betrayals happening, and the fate of kingdoms hanging in the balance. And then you have the Umayyads testing the Frankish borders with these increasingly bold raids.
These raids weren't just random looting, they were calculated moves, gathering information on the Franks' strengths and weaknesses, softening them up for a possible bigger fight. Imagine the fear and uncertainty that must have gripped the Frankish people as these attacks became more frequent and daring.
And then there's Duke Odo of Aquitaine, stuck between these two giants, forced to play this risky game of survival. He actually manages to get a big win against the Umayyads at Toulouse in 721.
But victory can be short-lived, especially when you're up against an opponent as relentless as the Umayyads. Just a few years later in 732, Odo suffers a crushing defeat. He's forced to swallow his pride and ask for help from his rival Charles Martel.
Talk about a high-stakes gamble. And Charles, being the smart political player he was, doesn't just offer help out of kindness. He demands Odo's submission and recognition of his authority. As the price for stepping in, it's a clear example of how personal ambition and power struggles were all tied up with this bigger conflict.
And so, the stage is set for the Battle of Tours. The Umayyads, full of confidence from their victories, were eager to plunder the riches of St. Martin's shrine in Tours, the most wealthy and important shrine in Gaul. It was a prize they couldn't resist.
And for Charles, this was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. The symbolic importance of St. Martin's, the potential loss of prestige and resources, not to mention the threat to his own power base. It all meant he had to take a stand.
So we have these two forces on a collision course, each one representing different military traditions and strengths. The Umayyads with their amazing cavalry and those deadly composite recurve bows, they could strike with incredible speed and accuracy. Their tactics were so advanced, they were masters of fake retreats, luring opponents in and then hitting back with a devastating counterattack.
But the Franks had their own advantages. They were known for their disciplined infantry, trained to fight shoulder to shoulder, in tight formations, creating an almost unbreakable shield wall. Sources describe them as a glacier, This unyielding force determined to hold their ground, and maybe most importantly, they were fighting for their homes, their faith,
Yeah.
and the symbolic heart of their kingdom.
It's that classic clash of styles, the lightning-fast mobility and ranged power of the Umayyads against the steadfast resilience and unwavering discipline of the Franks. New Tours, the stage was set, and for like a whole week, these two powerful armies, they faced off. Just imagine the anticipation, the tension as they sized each other up, waiting for the right time to strike.
It must have been a chess match on a huge scale,
Hmm.
each commander trying to guess what the other would do, next looking for that one advantage.
So what do the sources say about how the battle finally started?
The sources paint a really vivid picture. You can almost hear it. The noise of these two massive armies clashing, the thunder of thousands of men, the clang of swords, the cries of the wounded. It must have been pure chaos and brutality. It's hard to even imagine the sheer size of it all. Thousands and thousands of men locked in this desperate struggle with the fate of kingdoms on the line. Did the Franks' famous discipline hold up against the fierceness of the Umayyad attack?
The Franks. They stood firm, their shield wall, absorbing that initial onslaught of the Umayyad cavalry. But the Umayyads wouldn't let up. Their mounted archers rained arrows down on the Frankish ranks, testing their resolve.
So even with those disciplined formations, the Franks must have suffered heavy losses. Those arrows from the composite bows, they were lethal, piercing armor from afar. So what was Charles Martel's strategy against this onslaught?
Charles knew that if his troops broke ranks and chased after the Umayyad cavalry, it would be a disaster. They were too mobile, it would play right into their hands, leaving the Franks open to counterattacks and flanking maneuvers. He needed to keep his forces together, maintain that shield wall, and wait for the perfect moment.
It must have taken incredible discipline to hold back, especially with the enemy right there. Were there any key moments or turning points that changed the course of the battle?
The sources describe the death of Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the Umayyad commander. It's unclear how exactly he died, but it definitely shook the Umayyad forces, created a leadership void at a critical point.
Losing your leader. In the middle of all that chaos, it must have been a huge blow. Did it cause the Umayyad forces to fall apart, or did they keep fighting?
Even though their commander was dead, the Umayyads kept attacking. But their attacks started to lose steam as the Franks held strong, refusing to be drawn out. Just picture the exhaustion on both sides, fighting for hours under the hot sun, each push met with unyielding resistance.
As the day went on, the Umayyads must have realized breaking through those Frankish lines was just impossible. They lost their initial momentum, their attacks blunted by that disciplined Frankish defense. Did Charles Martel then seize the opportunity to go on the offensive?
No, and this is where Charles Martel's discipline and strategic genius really show. Instead of ordering a risky counterattack, he held his ground, kept his forces together, and refused to give the Umayyads an opening. It might not sound exciting, but holding back was the key to the Frankish victory.
So, instead of risking a costly pursuit, he let the Umayyads retreat. It must have been tempting to chase after them and try to destroy them completely. But Charles clearly understood that patience and discipline were his best weapons. So what happened next?
As night fell and the fighting died down, both sides prepared for another day of battle. But when the Franks woke up the next morning, they saw something unexpected. The Umayyad camp was completely empty.
You're kidding. They just disappeared. After all that, after days of maneuvering and hours of fierce fighting, the Umayyads just packed up and left.
Yes. Under the cover of darkness, they slipped away, leaving their tents and most of their loot. Imagine the Franks approaching that abandoned camp cautiously, half expecting a trap, but finding nothing but the leftovers of a rushed retreat.
I bet it was a mix of relief, disbelief, and maybe even a bit of disappointment. They had won, a decisive victory, but it wasn't that glorious route they might have expected. It was a victory built on patience, discipline, and a deep understanding of the enemy's strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah. And it's precisely this victory, achieved through military skill and strategic cleverness, that has made the Battle of Tours such a debated and fascinating topic for centuries.
So the Umayyads, they looked unstoppable just days before, and then they just vanished into the night. You're left with the Franks victorious, but probably a little confused. What happened then? Did Charles Martel chase after them?
He didn't, and that's important for understanding what happened after. The sources say the Umayyads went back over the Pyrenees Mountains, basically ending their deep raids into Frankish territory. But was this really the hammer blow that ended their ambitions in Europe forever, like some people say?
Right. It's easy to see why the Battle of Tours is often seen as this crucial moment, the battle that saved Christendom. But you've also said The historical truth is more complicated.
Exactly. Remember the Berber revolt we talked about? It happened just a few years after Tours. And this uprising in North Africa really weakened the Umayyad Caliphate. So even without Charles Martel's victory, their plans for expansion might not have worked out in the long run.
So maybe the Battle of Tours wasn't the only thing that stopped Islam from taking over all of Europe, like some stories say.
Right. It was a big win for the Franks, for sure. It solidified their hold on Gaul and made Charles Martel much more powerful. But saying it single-handedly saved Europe from Islamic rule, that's probably too simple.
But it must have had some kind of ripple effect, right? It had to have some lasting impact on both the Frankish kingdom and the bigger political scene in Europe.
Absolutely. The victory at Tours cemented Charles Martel's position as the most powerful person in the Frankish kingdom. He used this new authority to make his power even stronger, which paved the way for his son Pepin the Short to officially remove the Merovingian dynasty and start the Carolingian line of kings.
Wow. So we're talking about a potential turning point in the history of dynasties. If Charles hadn't won at Tours, would we even know about Charlemagne? Would the Frankish kingdom have developed the same way?
It's an interesting thought experiment. It's impossible to know for sure, but the Battle of Tours definitely played a role in shaping how the Frankish kingdom developed. And because of that, it affected the political landscape of Europe.
Beyond the political side of things, what about the cultural and religious legacy of the Battle of Tours? Did it contribute to a sense of Western identity, a Europe defined against Islam?
That's a great question, and historians are still debating it. The Battle of Tours wasn't the only cause, but it definitely fed into a growing idea that Islam was a threat to Christendom. That idea would shape European politics, religion, and culture for centuries.
So things like the Crusades, the Reconquista in Spain, even the development of those separate Western and Islamic spheres of influence.
Yeah, and while those events were caused by a lot of different things, the memory of the Battle of Tours and the broader historical context, and it represents, definitely had a hand in shaping those us versus them narratives, which unfortunately still exist today.
It's like this one battle, no matter how important it actually was in history, became this symbolic event, a way to understand the relationship between these two cultures, even centuries later.
It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's also about how we interpret those events, the stories we tell ourselves about the past, and how those stories affect how we see the world around us.
We've covered a lot today.
Right.
From the rise of the Umayyad Caliphate to the complexities of Frankish politics, the clash of armies at Tours, and the battle's lasting impact on history. What are some of the key things you hope our listeners will think about?
I think the biggest takeaway is that history is rarely about simple stories of good versus evil or decisive turning points. The Battle of Tours, like so many events in history, was the result of many factors, ambitions and decisions, and its meaning is still debated and reinterpreted, which reminds us that the past is never truly settled.
It reminds us to be careful of those oversimplified historical narratives, the ones that often divide us more than they unite us. So to our listeners, if this deep dive has made you curious, keep digging. Explore the original sources, look into the different interpretations, and question the things that are often presented as historical fact.
Exactly. Approach history on your own terms, and you'll discover it's a constantly changing conversation full of nuanced debate. And most importantly, it's a chance for us to learn and grow from the experiences of those who came before us.
Well said. And with that, we'll leave you with one final thought. How did the perception of Islam, shaped in battles like Tours, influence the development of Western European identity in the centuries that followed? It's a tough question with no easy answers, but it's definitely worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep that curiosity alive.